All right. Hi, everyone. Professor Rawlslyn Francis here, and this is
Heidi Marshall.
Hi, Dr. Heidi Marshall, and we are here with you all today to discuss some themes from the famous poet Anne Sexton. And Dr. Heidi Marshall you are an admirer of her work.
I am.
And you teach a lot of her material in your courses. So I invited her here today to talk to us about themes from Anne Sexton's work. So I hope you enjoy our webinar. And Dr. Marshall, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Well, thanks for having me and asking me to be on your show, Rawlslyn. I'm happy to talk about Anne Sexton with anyone who wants to listen. So Anne Sexton was writing in mid-20th century, and I know that you guys will be studying that. So
they're coming up on modernist poets.
Right.
Yeah.
So she started writing in a lot of her works in the 50s and 60s, and she was born in Newton, Massachusetts. And, you know, several important things to know about her personal life that impact her poetry. And I wouldn't start with so much biography about a poet prior to reading their poetry, but it's really important with Anne Sexton because she was a poet in the confessional school of poetry. And so like Sylvia Plath, you know, she wrote a lot about her personal life and was very confessional about her own personal life. So she was very groundbreaking on topics of womanhood and feminism, and a lot of her poetry included conversations about abuse and incest and sex and menstruation. And so, you know, that was a lot of what was very important to her. She started writing actually because her therapist was encouraging her to write. So that's what started her writing her poetry was. Her therapist asked her to start writing. And then she had 2 daughters in the 50s, and she suffered from postpartum depression and wrote a lot about that and struggled with that, certainly.
And at the time, postpartum, was that even something that women would talk about at the time, right?
Almost everything that Anne Sexton wrote about was taboo. It was not okay. It was not okay for her to write about any of those things that she wrote about. And so, unfortunately, when she was 46, she committed suicide. She poured herself a glass of vodka, put on her mother's fur coat, and went into her garage, her closed garage, and started her car and got in her car.
Wow. So
that's her life. She was beautiful. She modeled. She was a fashion model. And there's a lot of debate still about her life on whether or not she abused her own children physically and or sexually, and about her own abuse physically and sexually as a child growing up. So, and there's a lot of debate about that.
Wow.
So that's Anne Sexton.
Some background on her.
Yes.
Okay.
But also another great thing about her was she was very, very famous during her time. She was popular and well known and won a ton of awards during her time. So she, you know, got to live the poet celebrity lifestyle. You know,
even like you said, with all of that fame and success, she still was quite troubled personally and committed suicide.
Yeah, and her poetry is very personal. It's highly personal. So
okay.
So I thought we would read a few of her poems.
All right.
Today. I think on the screen, those are her collections.
Which one do you want to read first?
I think we can start at Menstruation at 40.
All right. And while I pull that for everyone, let them know a little bit. Any background you want to share first, or just go right into reading it?
You know, I already mentioned her taboo topics. And so why don't we just, you know, we'll just go right into it. And menstruation is one of them, certainly. So, you know, she certainly wanted to talk about things that women were not allowed to talk about.
Right. And I'm sure everyone can see it.
Right. Good.
They can. Great. Okay. Everyone can see our screen.
You know, one of the things you and I had talked about last time was this inability for women to talk about highly personal things. You know, some of her poems talk about masturbation, let alone menstruation, sex, things like that.
Right.
And I think it was Stephen King's mother who he said, She died of embarrassment because she wouldn't talk about the pain
Right.
that she was having, and she eventually died of ovarian cancer.
Right.
And so these are things that, women were not allowed to talk about their personal issues like this.
Right.
And so are women having their periods at 40? Yes. Are they thinking about whether or not they're having children? Yes. So this is a poem where Anne Sexton is addressing a son she's never had.
Right.
Because as we know about menstruation, it's the possibility of birth that isn't, right? So she's talking to this son. She has named him. And she addresses him and says, will you be the person, will you be the David I never had,
Mm-hmm.
She, later in the poem, she imagines waiting up for him and him being a teenager, and the possibility of him who has never been. So
Great.
Good.
It's just that.
It's great. So I'm going to read to you this poem.
Great.
Menstruation at 40 by Anne Sexton. I was thinking of a son. The womb is not a clock nor a bell tolling, but in the 11th month of its life, I feel the November of the body as well as of the calendar. In 2 days, it will be my birthday, and as always, the earth is done with its harvest. This time I hunt for death, the night I lean toward, the night I want. Well then, it was in the womb all along. I was thinking of a son, you, the never acquired, the never seated or unfastened, you of the genitals I feared, the stalk and the puppy's breath. Will I give you my eyes or his? Will you be the David or the Susan? Those two names I picked and listened for. Can you be the man your fathers are? The leg muscles from Michelangelo, hands from Yugoslavia? Somewhere the peasant, Slavic and determined. Somewhere the survivor bulging with life. And could it still be possible, all this with Susan's eyes? All this without you, 2 days gone in blood. I myself will die without baptism, a third daughter they didn't bother. My death will come on my named day. It's only an angel of the sun. Woman, weaving a web over your own, a thin entangled poison. Scorpio, bad spider, die. My death from the wrists, 2 name tags, blood worn like a corsage to bloom, one on the left and one on the right. It's a warm room, the place of the blood. Leave the door open on its hinges. 2 days for your death and 2 days until mine. Red disease. Year after year, David, you would make me wild. David, Susan, David, David. Full and disheveled, hissing into the night, never growing old. Waiting always for you on the porch, year after year. My carrot, my cabbage. I would have possessed you before all women, calling your name, calling you mine.
All right.
So Anne Sexton, many of her poems feature death. They always mention death.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually blood. And she's usually toying with those motifs in some way.
Right.
And in this way, certainly, when we look at blood, we look at stanza 3.
Okay, stanza 3.
All this without you, 2 days gone in blood. I myself will die without baptism. So there's this motif of the blood of her eventual death, and the darkness of her death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what she's talking about there, bad spider, die. But then it's also his death, He's being reborn and she's being reborn and then dying and being reborn and dying. And it's cyclical, kind of like your cycle.
Sure. Sure.
And so
I'm going to put us back on.
Sure. Here.
Let me stop.
Yeah.
All right. We're back on.
Yep. So, that's Menstruation at 40 by Anne Sexton.
Any other lines you want? I know, like, before I asked you about the my carrot, my cabbage, and we kind of thought that was just terms of endearment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this because it is an opportunity for a woman's voice to speak about an emotion. And I think most importantly, the title gives it away. It's at 40. It's a woman's voice at 40. This is when you're thinking about half of your life being gone, but you still have the potential to be a mother. And so where are you in this poem? At the beginning of your life, at the end of your life? And it's all complicated, and things are often very complicated in her poems, and I like that because life isn't very simple, you know?
Right.
So it's a good one.
It is a very good one. There's a lot to that one.
Yeah.
All right. Which one do you want to look at
The
next?
Touch by Anne Sexton.
Okay. Let me share that for all of you. One moment.
Okay.
Let's go. Share screen. I have the entire screen. So I want to make sure there's no mistake.
Here we are.
Let's go to the Touch. Let me make sure. Present. To everyone. Okay.
So everyone's seeing it.
Let me make sure it's there. I think on the other one it might not have shown it, but I'll just include, you know, a link for them to see the first one.
Oh, sure.
I think this time they can see this one.
Okay, good. Fine.
All right.
This is one of my favorite poems by Anne Sexton, personally, because I don't know, maybe because I'm just an affectionate person. It makes me think about a lot of things about how people connect. And I certainly think Anne Sexton's poetry is about people connecting. And so the poem is about a woman not touching anyone and not having anyone to touch her.
Right.
So it's the first 5 stanzas are about the inability to touch someone, and she feels like her hands are dying. And they are, you know, cut off from the world, and they're boxed up because her hands have nothing to touch. And one of my favorite lines is, you know, nothing to touch but the subway railings. And then her dog won't even do it, and her father and her sisters, and there is nothing. She has no affection in her life. And her fingers are stitched up and closed off, and I think she says blind in places in stanza 2. And then you'll see a tone shift. You'll see the shift in the poem, and in the sixth stanza, excuse me, you see where the tone shifts, and she says, "Then all this became history. Your hand found mine," and you see that she has someone to touch. You know, one of my other favorite lines of the poem before I read it to you is in the 3rd stanza. She says, "And all this is a metaphor. You know, it's just an ordinary hand lonely for something to touch that touches back," you know. And I like a poem that, you know, in theater that would be called breaking the fourth wall, where you kind of just like face your audience and state to your audience, you know, the point.
Right.
And so she sort of breaks the fourth wall and says, you know, this is just a metaphor. I'm just lonely for affection. And that's what I'm trying to say here when I'm talking about my hand being stitched up, you know. And so it's important in poetry for people to understand tone. And I like this poem because you see a tone shift. You see where in the first few stanzas, the person is sad and forlorn. That the tone is just a fancy word for feeling, you know, and what is the voice feeling, you know? And at this point, the voice is, you know, in the first part of the poem, the voice feels depressed and sad and lonely. It shifts in that final stanza. Then all this became history. And it's so romantic and it's so happy, and there's such joy in the final stanza. You know, our hands dancing together in Vienna, and my hand is alive all over America. And so it's a great example of tone and tone shift.
Absolutely.
I tell my students when they're approaching a poem to look for 3 things when they read a poem, so as I'm reading this to you guys, think about these 3 things, and this is how you could tackle a poem. Who is talking to me? What are they talking about? And what are their feelings about it? So that is, in fancier literary terms, voice, subject, and tone.
Voice, subject, and tone.
Yes, right. So who's talking to me? Voice. What are they talking about? Subject. About it, tone. So if you can figure out voice, subject, tone, every time you read a poem, if you can like answer those 3 things, you can get into that poem and it's accessible then. And poetry isn't going to be scary anymore. And you can say, okay, it's a dentist talking about a patient and he's angry. Yeah. You know, or it's a father talking about his daughter and he's happy, you know. So if you could just figure out who's talking to you, what they're talking about, and what their feelings are about it, you know, then you can really tackle a poem. Great. So I'm going to read to you The Touch. Okay. The Touch by Anne Sexton. For months, my hand was sealed off in a tin box. Nothing was there but the subway railings. Perhaps it is bruised, I thought, and that is why they have locked it up. You could tell time by this, I thought, like a clock, by its 5 knuckles and the thin underground veins. It lay there like an unconscious woman fed by tubes she knew not of. The hand had collapsed, a small wood pigeon that had gone into seclusion. I turned it over and the palm was old, its lines traced like a fine needle point and stitched up into fingers. It was fat and soft and blind in places, nothing but vulnerable. And all this is a metaphor, an ordinary hand just lonely for something to touch that touches back. The dog won't do it. Her tail wags in the swamp for a frog. I'm no better than a case of dog food. She owns her own hunger. My sisters won't do it. They live in a school except for buttons and tears running down like lemonade. My father won't do it. He comes in the house, and even at night, he lives in a machine made by my mother and well-oiled by his job. His job. The trouble is that I'd let my gestures freeze. The trouble was not in the kitchen or the tulips, but only in my head. My head. Then, all this became history. Your hand found mine. Life rushed to my fingers like a blood clot. Oh, my carpenter, the fingers are rebuilt. They dance with yours. They dance in the attic and in Vienna. My hand is alive all over America. Not even death will stop it. Death shedding her blood. Nothing will stop it, for this is the kingdom and the kingdom come. So, she doesn't let you go without some blood and some death.
she's gotta throw that in there.
Right, sure.
Put us back on the screen.
Sure. So even in the most positive stanza,
okay.
Yeah, even in the most positive stanza, she's letting you know that death and blood are there for you. But, as I described to you guys, there's all the very metaphorical, beautiful imagery of the hand being stitched up and being closed off and kind of blind and dead to the world. And then all this became history in the final stanza.
That second stanza always sticks out to me. The hand had collapsed, a small wood pigeon that had gone into seclusion.
Mm-hmm.
The palm was old, stitched up into fingers, nothing but vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where's the hand railings in this, right?
Right. For months, my hand was, the very beginning of the poem, for months my hand was sealed off in a tin box. Nothing was there but the subway railings.
Tell them about that line that really sticks out to me too. Like, the thought of the only thing you're touching are subway railings of a hand that's touched it before, but
that's it. You may be connected to people by a previous hand that has touched the subway railing, but you're not really connected to anyone. The subway railing is an inanimate object, it's not another person. And so, that's important when she says, and all this is a metaphor, an ordinary hand just lonely for something to touch that touches back. And, the subway railing is providing that for you. And, affection is so important. I mean,
absolutely.
You think about, nursing homes that have dogs and cats, and there's studies about how that prolongs their life. I mean, because there's that sense of affection that we all need and we crave.
I feel like that for me is what poetry does so well. Just like if you and I just mentioned, like, man, all I've touched is a subway railing, but the way that she encapsulates it in the abstractness, the metaphors, like we get it. We get that, like, man, understand the days maybe you just have the cold touch of a door.
Right.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
And then I just want to share with you guys a really famous line from Small Wire.
From Small Wire?
Yes.
Okay. While you're pulling it up, I'll get that one up for the audience here.
She often, mentions religion, and there are many religious motifs in her poetry. We just read, and that is in the kingdom and the kingdom come. And so Small Wire is about faith. And so the first line is, my faith is a great weight hung on a small wire. But I just wanted to share with you guys in our final couple minutes here, as we finish talking about Anne Sexton, is a famous line that she has in stanza 2. So it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th line. This is just one of her most famous lines, and it's on little memes all over the web, As it has been said, love in a cough cannot be concealed. Even a small cough, even a small love.
I love that.
You can't conceal either one. So, you know, and most of her poetry is about not concealing any of that. She was very honest and open, and I think that put off a lot of people, but I think it also awakened a lot of people.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Let me pull us back on here.
Sure.
I'm glad that I wanted to share that with all of them too. Okay, we're back. Yeah, I love, you know, a small cough cannot be concealed and a small love cannot be concealed.
Even a small cough, even a small love.
Mm-hmm. So within it, like final thoughts, wrapping up, what do you want to leave our audience with on why it's important to talk about Anne Sexton? Why should we study her in any type of literature or college course? What's important to remember about her?
Most importantly, that she revolutionized women's poetry because of her topics, because her topics were so revolutionary, and it was not okay at that time to talk about the things she was talking about. And she broke so many barriers by saying, I want to talk about these things. These are women's issues. I want to talk about mastectomies, you know, and I want to talk about women's issues. I want to talk about my menstruation, and I want to talk about masturbation. I want to talk about sex and all of those things that we're not allowed to talk about, I guess, you know. And she did it in this incredibly beautiful, metaphorical, oftentimes tragic way. And, you know, she talked about abuse and, you know, domestic violence. And there's her collection, the collection that was edited by Maxine Kumin in 1999, The Complete Poems, is really the best collection because it's all of her work. And you really see over time how revolutionary it was to talk about those kinds of things.
And for her to be part of the modernist movement, I guess that makes sense that she's going, you know, it's not the Victorian time where you're fit in this box, prim and proper. We don't discuss those things, darling. Like and this is post, her poetry said 50s. So post, of course, World War I and World War II. So definitely society is like, this is what's going on with humanity. Let's look at how we're living our lives and talking about things that we
and I would categorize her, if I had to push for a category, postmodern.
Okay.
Because she, you know, the modernists weren't really open to women as much. And so I think because of a lot of her writing happened in the 60s as well. And it was a little bit risque in its subject matter. I think she was a little bit more postmodern than modern, but I think certainly she was probably
maybe on the
educated.
Edge.
I think she was on the edge.
She grew up in the modernist time.
And I think she was educated on modernist literature for sure. So she was a product of that, and certainly
that's a good way to put it.
And then if I had to push her into a category, I would say postmodern. But it's hard with women's lit, honestly, to put them in categories because I think the categories were designed by men for men. So it's easy to say Steinbeck modernist, T.S. Eliot modernist, because they fit the definition so nicely, and that's another video. But you know, to talk about, you know,
that's a great point because you're using those male artists' work and their life experiences to create and define these literary genres: modernist, postmodernist, Renaissance, Victorian, and so forth. So that's an interesting take on that. Like, well, some put her modern, but you say more postmodern. So that's
and that's pushing me to even put her in a category. I would like to do that normally. I understand the movements and the literary movements, and we both teach them, you know. So I'm not afraid to use them, but I'm also aware of who made them and why. And the history behind that.
Interesting. Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Marshall, for your time today.
Thank you, Professor Francis.
All right, everyone. Well, I hope you found that interesting and got something from it. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.